I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I sat at the edge of my bed in that basement room, the one my son had painted beige to make it feel less like a storage space, and I stared at the wall until the sounds upstairs went quiet. It was a Tuesday night in late October. My son and his wife thought I was asleep. I wasn't. I'd heard every word. Let me back up, because none of this makes sense without the beginning. And the beginning started 3 years ago when my doctor sat across from me in a beige office just like that basement room and told me I had early-stage congestive heart failure. Not the kind that kills you next week, the kind that changes everything slowly, like water wearing down stone. I was 64 years old. I had a pension from 31 years of working as a hospital administrator in Columbus, Ohio. I owned my house, a two-bedroom colonial on Maple Creek Drive that I'd paid off 7 years before my retirement. My husband, God rest him, had been gone for 11 years by then. I had learned to do everything myself. Groceries, taxes, the gutter cleaning every fall that I really should have hired out. I was not a burden. I had never been a burden. That was the thing I kept coming back to in the months after the diagnosis. My son called me the night I told him. He was kind on the phone. Concerned. He said all the right things. He said, "Mom, you shouldn't be alone in that house." He said, "We have this space. We've been talking about it." He said his wife agreed. She had seemed to agree. She'd texted me a little heart emoji when he told her the news. I put my house on the market in February. It sold in 11 days. This was still a seller's market in Columbus even then, and I made a decent profit on it. I set aside a portion in a money market account, put the rest in a combination of CDs and a mutual fund my financial advisor had managed for me since my husband passed. I wasn't wealthy, but I wasn't helpless either. I moved into my son's house in March. They lived in a suburb of Cincinnati, a newer development with wide driveways and HOA rules about what color you could paint your front door. The house was large, 4 bedrooms, 3.5 baths. The finished basement had its own bathroom and a small kitchenette. My son showed it to me like he was presenting a gift, and I thanked him and I told him it was lovely, because it was. It was lovely. His wife stood in the doorway with her arms crossed loosely, smiling at the right moments. She was 37. She worked in commercial real estate. She had the kind of energy that filled a room without exactly warming it. I had always sensed that she tolerated me more than she welcomed me, but I had told myself that was a mother-in-law thing, a universal friction that time would smooth over. Time did not smooth it over. The first few months were fine. I kept to myself. I cooked sometimes on Sunday afternoons, pot roast, the kind my son had loved since he was small, and I always made enough for the whole family. I babysat my granddaughter when she was home from preschool. She was 4, and she called me Nana, and she would climb into my lap with a book and expect me to read the whole thing twice, which I always did. Twice, sometimes 3 times. That child was the reason I woke up in a good mood most mornings. My daughter-in-law did not dislike me. I want to be fair. She didn't dislike me the way some women dislike their mothers-in-law, with open comments and pointed looks. She disliked me the way a person dislikes clutter, a low-grade ambient irritation at something that didn't fit the picture she had of her own home. By summer, small things began to happen. She rearranged the kitchen cabinets without telling me, so I reached for the mugs one morning and found them gone. She started scheduling family dinners on nights she knew I had plans. Not to exclude me, she would say. Just how the timing worked out. She mentioned to my son, not to me directly, that she wished I wouldn't let the baby watch television before dinner. I found that out because my son told me in a cautious, careful way, like he was diffusing something. I adjusted. I always adjusted. That is what you do when you are 64 years old and have spent a lifetime learning that adaptation is not defeat. In September, I had a cardiology appointment that went less well than the previous one. My ejection fraction had decreased slightly. Not dramatically, not an emergency, but enough that my cardiologist wanted to add a second medication and see me monthly instead of quarterly. I told my son that evening over dinner. I kept my voice steady. I told him the facts, not the fear. His wife put down her fork. She asked how long-term this kind of management typically was. It was a reasonable question, phrased in a reasonable tone, and I answered it. I said it was ongoing. I said that heart failure was a chronic condition, managed rather than cured. She nodded and picked her fork back up and said, "I see." 2 weeks later was the Tuesday in October. I had gone to bed early because the new medication made me tired in the evenings. I was not asleep. I was lying in the dark, reading on my phone, when I heard them in the kitchen directly above my head. The floor plan of the house was such that sound traveled in strange ways, and my bed was positioned beneath the kitchen island. I had noticed this before, the scrape of a chair, the closing of a cabinet. That night I heard voices. I heard my daughter-in-law say, "I'm not going to watch this get worse for the next 10 years. I heard my son say something I couldn't make out clearly. She said louder, "This is our home, our daughter's home. I didn't sign up to run a care facility." He said her name. Low, cautioning. She said, "I love your mother, but she needs a level of care and a living situation that we cannot provide. There are beautiful places. There are independent living communities with medical staff. That is the right answer here, and you know it." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I'll talk to her." I put my phone face down on the mattress. I lay in the dark for a long time listening to the silence above me, and I made a decision. Not a decision about what to say, a decision about what to do. I want you to understand something. I am not a dramatic woman. I do not make scenes. I do not send long emails cataloging grievances. My mother raised me to handle things with as much dignity as the situation allowed, and I have tried to live that way for 64 years. But there is a difference between dignity and passivity. There's a difference between being gracious and being a fool. I had made a mistake when I sold my house. Not because I trusted my son. That trust was not misplaced, not entirely, but because I had assumed that welcome would be permanent. That love was sufficient to sustain an arrangement. I know better now. I did not sleep much that night. By morning, I had a list. I did not tell them I had heard anything. I made coffee the way I always did, just before 7, and when my daughter-in-law came downstairs, I asked about her day, and she told me she had closings back to back, and I said that sounded exhausting, and she said it was fine. We were both performing normalcy with the precision of people who know the play is almost over. My son looked at me over his coffee mug with something like guilt around his eyes. I smiled at him. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had chosen his life and his household, which is a choice every adult child makes, and I did not blame him for the choice. I blamed him a little for the silence, for the weeks he had apparently spent turning this over without saying a word to me, for letting me find out through the ceiling. I had a friend, a woman I'd known since we were both young nurses' aides at Riverside Hospital 30-some years ago, who was a recently retired real estate paralegal. I called her from my car that morning, parked in a strip mall 2 miles from the house. I told her what I needed. She told me who to call. I spent the next 3 weeks doing things I did not discuss with my son or his wife. I called a real estate agent who worked primarily with seniors in transition. I looked at apartments, not independent living communities, not assisted living, not any of the options my daughter-in-law had in mind when she'd spoken about beautiful places. I looked at apartments in a building in the Oakley neighborhood of Cincinnati, a walkable area with a farmer's market on Saturdays and a cardiac rehabilitation center 3 blocks away. The building had a concierge, an in-unit laundry, and a rooftop terrace, and I could afford it with my pension and my savings, and I would be fine. I also called my attorney. I had a will that I drafted 8 years ago, and I had not revisited it since. I revisited it. I had planned to leave the bulk of my estate split between my son and a few charitable organizations I'd supported for years. The estate was not enormous. A solid middle-class accumulation, the kind that represents a lifetime of not wasting what you have. After the house sale, my liquid assets were more substantial than they had been. I spent 2 hours on the phone with my attorney, and another hour reviewing documents she sent me. I did not make decisions out of anger. Anger is not a sound basis for estate planning, but clarity is, and I had a great deal of clarity. I signed a lease on the apartment on a Thursday afternoon. I paid first, last, and security deposit with a personal check, and I did not feel anything complicated about it. I felt like a woman who had finally remembered who she was. I told my son the following Sunday. I waited until his wife had taken my granddaughter to a birthday party because I wanted to speak to him without the performance his wife would have required, the reassurances, the explanations, the management of her reaction alongside my own feelings. I sat across from him at the kitchen table where I had eaten dinner 6 nights a week for 7 months, and I said, "I've found an apartment. I'm moving out at the end of the month." He stared at me. He said, "Mom, where is this coming from?" I looked at him for a moment. I thought about saying it plainly. I heard you. I heard her. I heard every word through the floor at 10:30 on a Tuesday night, and I have been arranging my exit ever since. But I didn't say that. Not because I wanted to protect him from the discomfort of being caught, because I no longer needed the conversation to go any particular way. I didn't need him to apologize. I didn't need his wife to feel guilty. I needed to move into my apartment. I said, I think it's the right time. I've found a beautiful place, and I'm very much looking forward to it. He pushed back, the way children push back when they sense the ground shifting. He said they had plenty of room. He said it wasn't necessary. He said his wife would be upset if she thought I was leaving because of anything she'd done. I said, I'm leaving because I want my own home. That's allowed. He didn't argue after that. My daughter-in-law came home 2 hours later with my granddaughter, who ran straight to me and said, Nana, there was a bouncy castle. And I held her and told her that sounded wonderful. And I asked about the cake flavor, and she said it was rainbow, and I said rainbow was a very good choice. Over her head, I watched my daughter-in-law's expression cycle through several things in quick succession as my son said something quietly to her in the entryway. She came and sat across from me at the table after my granddaughter had run off to find a toy. She said, We don't want you to feel like you have to leave. I said, I don't feel that way at all. She said, If this is about the medical situation, we're fully committed too. I said, I know you are. I found a wonderful apartment in Oakley. There's a cardiac rehab center very close by. My cardiologist actually thinks having my own routine and space will be good for me. That last part was true. My cardiologist had said something like it. I had perhaps emphasized it more than she had intended. My daughter-in-law looked at me for a moment with an expression I had not seen from her before. Something careful and slightly off balance, she said. Well, if that's what you want. I said, It is. I moved out 12 days later on a Saturday. My son helped carry boxes. My daughter-in-law made coffee and kept my granddaughter occupied and did not come downstairs to the basement while we packed. When the last box was in my son's truck, my granddaughter appeared at the top of the stairs in her pajamas. It was early, still before 9, and she looked at me with the expression children have when they understand something is changing, but not exactly what. I went back up the stairs and crouched down and held her for a long time. I told her my new apartment had a guest room with her name on it, and that we were going to have Saturday sleepovers and bake banana bread, and she could pick whatever movie she wanted. She pulled back and looked at me very seriously and said, Twice? I said, We'll watch it 3 times if you want. She seemed satisfied with this arrangement. My apartment was on the 4th floor, and it had windows facing west, and in the evenings, the light came in at a low angle that turned everything warm and amber. I arranged my furniture. I hung the photographs I'd had in storage since I sold the house. I put my mother's quilt on the guest bed. I bought a small table for the balcony and a succulent that my neighbor in the hallway, a retired teacher named Opal, who had lived there for 6 years and knew everyone, told me was basically impossible to kill. I was not lonely. I want to say that clearly because people assume you must be when you are 64 and living alone and managing a chronic illness and recently moved out of your son's house under circumstances that were not entirely cheerful. I was not lonely. I was quieter than I had been, but quiet was not loneliness. Quiet was mine. My cardiac health stabilized over the following months. The new medication worked. My ejection fraction and my March appointment had actually improved a small amount. My cardiologist said the word encouraging, and I wrote it in my phone's notes app the way I used to write encouraging things on index cards when I was putting my son through college. In April, my son called me more than he had in the previous year combined. I don't know whether his wife knew about the frequency of those calls. I didn't ask. We talked about his daughter, about his job, about small things and eventually larger ones. He told me one evening, haltingly, that things had been tense at home. He did not elaborate, and I did not press. I said I was always happy to hear his voice, and that was true. In May, something happened that I had not anticipated. My daughter-in-law called me. Not my son, her. On a Thursday afternoon while I was on my balcony with Opal, who came by some mornings with coffee from the place downstairs. She said she needed to talk to me about something sensitive. I told her to go ahead. She said that she and my son had been experiencing some financial pressure. She said it in the measured, practiced tone of someone who had rehearsed it. She said there had been a deal she'd been counting on in her commercial real estate work that had fallen through. She said they had a gap. I listened. She said she knew it was a lot to ask. She said she hoped I understood that she never would have asked if it wasn't necessary. I said, "What are you asking?" She said the number. It was significant. Not ruinous for me, not by a long way, given the assets I had carefully managed, but significant. Enough to have real impact on my son's household. Enough that I understood she was not calling out of pride. I was quiet for a moment. Opal had gone inside by then, and I was alone on the balcony with the afternoon light going long across the building, across the street. I thought about what to say. I said, "I'd like to talk to my son directly, the three of us, together." There was a brief pause. She said, "Of course." We met at my apartment the following weekend. My granddaughter stayed with a neighbor of theirs. My son sat at my kitchen table, the small round table I'd bought at an estate sale in Oakley, the one with the nick in the edge that I liked, and he looked tired in a way that had not been there before. His wife sat across from me, and she had the quality of someone who had been very carefully managed by circumstances she had not expected. I'd spoken to my attorney again in the week between the phone call and this meeting. Not to be calculating. To be careful. There is a difference. I looked at my son and I said, "I would like to help. You're my child. That doesn't stop." He exhaled. I said, "I'm going to be honest with both of you about something." I looked at his wife. I kept my voice level. "I heard your conversation in October. I was in the basement. The acoustics in that house carry in ways I don't think either of you realized." She went very still. My son closed his eyes briefly. I said, "I'm not telling you this to make you feel guilty. I'm telling you because I want us to be honest with each other going forward. If we're going to have the kind of relationship where I am helping you financially, and you are raising my granddaughter and we are in each other's lives." I paused. "I don't want to pretend things didn't happen. That's exhausting, and at my age I don't have the energy for it." My daughter-in-law looked at me for a long moment. Something crossed her face that I had never seen from her before. I'm not entirely sure what it was. Something between shame and something more open. She said, "I'm sorry, I handled it wrong. I should have talked to you." I said, "Yes, you should have." My son said, "Mom, I should have." I said, "You both should have, and you didn't. And I made the best decision I could with the information I had, which was to give myself back my own life." I let that sit for a moment. And frankly, that turned out very well, so I'm not asking for apologies. I'm asking for amity from here on. We sat with that for a moment. Outside my window, the city made its ordinary sounds. Someone on the street below was walking a dog. A truck was delivering something. I helped them. I want to be clear about this. I helped them because my son is my son, and my granddaughter needed stability, and because I was in a position to help without compromising my own security, and because I have never believed that withholding care from people you love is a form of power. I structured it as a loan, documented with terms my attorney drafted, not out of suspicion, out of clarity. There are people who would say I should have let them struggle, that my daughter-in-law had been cold and calculating and deserved to face the consequences of the lies she'd built on assumptions about other people's helplessness. I understand that impulse, but I am 64 years old, and I have buried a husband and held the hands of dying patients and watched my own heart function numbers decrease on a monitor. And I have learned that the people who derive satisfaction from other people's suffering usually do so because they have not yet found the satisfaction available in their own lives. I had found mine. On the Saturday before Thanksgiving, my granddaughter came for our first official sleepover. She arrived with a small backpack that contained a stuffed rabbit, 2 books she wanted me to read, and a bag of chocolate chips because she had decided we were making cookies, not banana bread. I told her chocolate chip cookies were an excellent revision to the plan. We baked in the afternoon and watched her movie twice. She chose something about a panda who wanted to be a warrior, which I will admit was more entertaining than I expected. And in the evening she fell asleep on the pull-out sofa in the guest room with the stuffed rabbit under one arm and the credits still rolling. I stood in the doorway of that room for a while, watching her sleep. I thought about the past year, the Tuesday night in October when I'd lain in the dark and made a list, the apartment search, the attorney calls, the slow, sometimes uncomfortable work of rebuilding something honest in place of something that had been held together by silence. I thought about my daughter-in-law who had texted me that afternoon a photo of my son raking leaves in their yard with a caption that said, "He wanted me to tell you he's doing the gutters tomorrow like you asked." I had not asked, but I had mentioned sometime last spring that he really ought to do the gutters before winter. She was trying. People do sometimes. Not as quickly as you'd like, and not without needing to be shown what the alternative looks like. I turned off the light in the guest room, leaving the door slightly open the way she liked, and I went to my kitchen and made myself a cup of tea and stood at the window that faced west, looking out at the Cincinnati night, the lights scattered across the dark like something scattered there by hand. And I thought, I built this quiet, this light, this cup of tea in my own kitchen at 9:30 on a Saturday night. Nobody gave it to me. Nobody took it, though someone tried. I built this. And that, it turned out, was the thing I most needed to know about myself. There's a moment when you're standing in your own kitchen at 9:30 on a Saturday night with a cup of tea and the city spread out below you, when you understand something that no one can teach you ahead of time. You can read every self-help book ever printed. You can have wise friends and good instincts and 31 years of professional experience managing difficult situations, and still, some things you only learn by living them all the way through. I learned that how you respond to betrayal matters more than the betrayal itself. When I heard my daughter-in-law's voice through the ceiling that Tuesday night, calm, certain, already decided, I had a choice about who I was going to be in that moment. I could have walked upstairs and made a scene. I could have confronted them both and demanded apologies and turned that house into a courtroom. Some people would have. Some people would say I should have. But I knew, in the quiet of that basement room, that the version of myself I most respected would not do that. She would think, she would plan, she would act from a place of clarity rather than injury. That is not coldness. That is something I'd call the difference between reacting and deciding. My mother had it. I watched her navigate situations that would have leveled most people. My father's long illness, the years of financial uncertainty after he passed, the neighbors who were unkind, and the family members who disappointed her. And she moved through all of it with a particular quality I couldn't name when I was young. Now I can. It was self-possession, the knowledge that her life was hers to direct regardless of what anyone else did or said or decided about her. What happened to me and my son and his wife followed a logic that had nothing to do with luck. My daughter-in-law had built her sense of security on an assumption that I was dependent, that I needed her household more than I needed my own agency. When that assumption proved wrong, the entire structure she had built on top of it became unstable. That is not punishment. That is simply what happens when you make plans based on a false foundation. The consequences were her own architecture, falling. And James, my son, who I love without condition and will love until I cannot, he is learning something too. That silence in a marriage is not loyalty. That allowing something wrong to happen without a word is its own kind of choice, and choices carry weight. I did not lecture him about this. I didn't need to. The months of phone calls, the slowly rebuilding honesty between us. The Sunday afternoon he helped me hang the last of my photographs in the apartment and stayed for dinner, and we talked until 10 o'clock. That is him doing the work. I respect him for it. What I want, for anyone who has sat in a dark room at the wrong end of a conversation they weren't supposed to hear, is this. The ground you lose when someone underestimates you is recoverable. Your finances, your living situation, your daily routine. All of that can be rebuilt, and often rebuilt better than it was. What cannot be taken from you, if you refuse to give it away, is the knowledge of who you are and what you are capable of. I am 64 years old. I have a heart condition, a fourth-floor apartment with west-facing windows, a neighbor who brings coffee, a granddaughter who negotiates movie rewatches with the seriousness of a small attorney. I made every decision in this story with my eyes open and my hands steady and my values intact. That is what I built. Nobody gave it to me.